Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed, the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today I'm going to be interviewing Padmanabha Swami for the first time. He's a fellow Gauḍīya Vaishnava, but far more scholarly than myself. So Padmanabha Swami, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Pleasure to be here.
So, today we're going to be discussing impersonalism, and often Hare Krishnas will have a lot of criticisms for impersonalist philosophy, and also in the West, perhaps we could talk about a little bit how in Western philosophy, I'm not sure how much you're up on Western philosophy, or in Christianity and the different Western religions, they don't so much talk about impersonal versus personal divides. They talk about idolatry and different, that's a sort of different dichotomy they have. We could talk about that a little bit also. But in the East, it's very much been a debate between different schools of personalism versus personalism, whether God has a form or not, whether the self exists and so on. And the Hare Krishnas, you could say, are radical personalism, and our historical philosophical nemesis are the impersonalists, the Mayavadis, the Advaita Vedāntas. So maybe just say a few words about yourself to introduce yourself to the audience, and then you could describe the topic.
Well, I was born in Argentina 42 years ago, and I've been practicing Gauḍīya Vaishnava for the last 23 years or so, living a monastic life as a sannyasin. And I have spent this time mainly practicing and studying and teaching this particular monotheistic branch of Hinduism called Vaishnavism, more specifically in my case, Gauḍīya Vaishnavism. Which in itself is a personalist school of thought, although it considers an impersonal aspect of the absolute being also possible, and also often, as you mentioned, refers to impersonalism in the context of comparing or contrasting the views of its own school with that, of course, of the personalist school, impersonalist. So in that sense, I kind of became quite familiar with both approaches through transcendence, personal and impersonal, as well as the common non-dual foundation of these two schools, which, of course, each one of them will express in different ways as we may see today.
Maybe we should start by explaining non-dualism and how it could be different from personalism. Or you've got down here that we should probably talk about how in Hinduism you could have monotheism, you could have an actual personalistic view of the absolute.
Yeah. It's important to clarify that to begin with, because many people, especially in the West, when they hear about the notion of Hinduism, to begin with, they may think about stuff like polytheism or caste system, or when they hear about Vedanta, they may think immediately about Advaita Vedanta, which is impersonalism, as we may call it, and probably because of its, let's say, original influence when Swāmī B was in the famous Parliament of World Religions in 1893, and he presented Advaita Vedanta, and kind of that created a very foundational influence in the West. So the point is, although that's a general idea, gradually in time, more and more in the West and even in the East, people is becoming more aware that there are other forms of Vedanta apart from Advaita Vedanta. And of course, there are other forms of Hinduism apart from polytheism. And so there are Vedantic schools that are monotheistic, not only monistic or impersonal. So in relation to the monotheistic side of Hinduism, so to say, most of people nowadays do not consider that there is such a thing, interestingly. They do not think that Hinduism can be tied with monotheism due to the above mentioned reasons. And interestingly, most people nowadays speak in terms of the three great monotheistic religions, by invoking, as you know, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But actually, they don't know generally that there is a fourth one, which is Vaishnavism, which is the monotheistic expression of Hinduism. And interestingly, Vaishnavism is not only a fourth one, but including all of its different denominations, is actually the second in the list of the four world monotheistic religions, only after Christianity. And I've checked some recent numbers. And Christianity, of course, has 2.8 billion followers approx. And then comes Vaishnavism with 241 million, Then you have Islam with 230 million and Judaism with 30 million approx. So, of course, the notion of Hinduism encompasses many schools of thought, not only monotheistic traditions. Even atheism can be found in Hinduism. But of course, today we are focusing on these different expressions of its Vedantic side, no, like personal and impersonal, or monotheistic and monistic. So we can relate the terms. And these two schools present reality, interestingly, having, as you mentioned, a non-dual foundation. One of them, Impersonal Vedanta, also known as Advaita Vedanta, will teach that there is no variety whatsoever in the ultimate structure of reality. And I will call that, or because of that, I will refer to them also as radical non-dualism. And in contrast, other schools of thought of monotheistic Vedanta will postulate that although being non-dual, reality allows for diversity without compromising its non-dual foundation. So I'll refer to those schools as well throughout the talk as theistic non-dualism versus radical non-dualism. So that's a brief introduction in connection to the idea of monotheism, Hinduism, Vedanta, before delving into what these schools are about.
So you're saying Vaishnavism is the second most populous religion?
Yeah, I was surprised about that as well. I was not aware. That was brought recently to my attention.
I mean, I guess you could have a second category of non-Vaishnava Hinduism. How big would that be? Yeah. Is that smaller?
I didn't check those numbers, to be honest.
Right.
Of course, there are so many people in India that we can have millions in any of those categories. But I was surprised to know that Vaishnavism, again, with all its denominations put together, falls second in the whole list, while most people do not even think about monotheistic Hinduism at all.
Right, but you do get people who call themselves a Vaishnava, but when you ask them their views, they'll describe something very impersonalistic.
Well, I think that can happen with any of the other denominations as well.
True. Yeah, one thing I find it fascinating when Christians look to the East and find Hinduism interesting, how often they will be interested by Adi Shankaracharya's views, and that never ceases to confuse me. Because basically, from our perspective, what Adi Shankaracharya taught is basically atheism.
Yeah, I would say that, of course, we are speaking in general ways here, but I would say that some of the Western people somehow became fascinated by some of these proposals because, I don't know, maybe some of them may be quite frustrated with how their own religion has been like framed and presented, and they find some interesting nuances into these other schools, although they are not getting to the ultimate implications of that, as we will see today, which somehow at one point start to become problematic to your own theistic or monotheistic ideas if you follow a monistic notion. At some point there will be some type of clashing, if you want to call it like that, right?
Yeah, right. So should we move on to describing radical non-dualism and how it differs from other kinds of non-dualism?
So regarding radical non-dualism, or again, impersonalism or monism, Advaita Vedanta, all these are the same words, different words for the same idea. As I mentioned, different mystical traditions may have their own details that make themselves unique, but I think that before entering into detail of each tradition, it's important to lay this common foundational underlying common ground that all of them are non-dual. In Sanskrit, we have the term Advai, Advaita, Advaid. Interestingly, the term religion coming from religio, is like the task of putting together divided realities back together, like yoga, or like reunion. In Christianity, sometimes they will explain how the tree of knowledge of good and evil represents this either or dualism instead of what's beyond that of non-dualism. So when we speak about radical non-dualism, the term radical there comes from the Latin, of course, radix, which means it's connected to the root. And in this case implies that this view denies all distinction to the very core. So it is absolute in its denial of all forms of distinction. In other words, the perception of distinction, according to radical non-dualism, is due to illusion, while actual ultimate reality for them generally designated in the words as Brahman, does not include any form of diversity, individuality, nor even experience, interestingly, because there is only Brahman. So if there's only Brahman, there's no experiencer, and there's no experienced. And therefore there's no experience, because there's only Brahman. So in Advaita Vedanta, or impersonalism, distinction is only admitted only on an empirical level. And it's considered ultimately mithya, or false, in ultimate reality. So it's admitted on an empirical level, but without fundamental ontological existence. In Sanskrit, this mentioned Brahma Satya Jagan Mithya, which means only Brahman is real, everything else is false, basically. So many times this radical non-dualist impersonal conclusion has to do with a negation of what we perceive here in the world. What we may describe as the maximum attempt or reach of our logic, in the sense of, because logic has its limits, so someone may think, okay, if everything here is temporal and has a form, and has name, an identity, then eternal reality must be its opposite. Sometimes how we may think logically, devoid of form, devoid of name and identity. But of course, interestingly, Vedanta, which is the main source of revelation, scriptural text that radical non-dualists are based on, makes the point that logic in itself is insufficient. It says tarko pratishtana, which means logic is insufficient when trying to ascertain the ultimate reality. So as you mentioned, this system was originally proposed by Adi Shankar, which is considered as an incarnation of Shiva. And in the Puranas, it is mentioned about him, Maya Vadana Satchastram Prachanam Bodham Uchyate, where Shiva himself is speaking to his consort Parvati about how in the age of Kali, which is the present age according to the Vedas, he will descend in the form of a Brahman to distribute what's called as Mayavad philosophy, which is none other than covert Buddhism, interestingly. Prachanam Buddhyam Uchyate. So, interestingly, the main proposer of Mayavad philosophy, as it is called in the Puranas, is considered as Mahadev himself, which is a great devotee of Kṛṣṇa, according to what Shastra says. Vaishnavanam Jatasambhu, he's the best of Vaishnavas. But he's presenting a particular philosophy for a very specific need of the moment, which is to reestablish the position of the Vedas, which was somehow put away by Buddha and his campaign before. So although Sankaracharya presented radical non-dualism, if we study his life, we don't have time here to go into details, but we will see that he composed very beautiful verses, devotional verses, dedicated to Kṛṣṇa, a famous one called Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam, Mudamate Samprapti, Sanhitakal, etc. Which are very mysterious, because he's saying, just worship Govinda, another name for God, for Kṛṣṇa, just worship him. So he was internally, according to our vision and according to the revelation of Puranas, a Vaishnava, but he was not overtly, openly promoting that because of the specific purpose he had in mind. That, as it is mentioned, Buddha had to dismiss the Vedas in order to establish his doctrine on ahimsa, because people was over-justifying violence to animals and so on in the name of Vedic sacrifice. So he did away with the Veda, and he promoted ahimsa. And then Sankaracharya came, reestablished the Veda, but only in this half-baked, if you will, level of interpretation, without considering the possibility of diversity and promoting monism. So this interestingly great Sankaracharya, although he promotes that, in his inner world is mentioned as regarding the form and pastimes of Kṛṣṇa, officially he says that's a creation of Maya, only Brahman is real. But internally, in some of his compositions, he's revealing a secret desire. Even in one of his poetry is mentioned to be in Vrindavan and sit in this holy land of Kṛṣṇa, sitting on the banks of the sacred river Yamuna, and pass each long day of his life in the twinkling of an eye meditating on Kṛṣṇa. So that's a brief words about this radical non-dualism proposal. Of course, we can continue developing later.
What would a follower of Adi Shankaracharya's teaching say about those verses that you quoted where Lord Shiva is saying, I'm going to come and bewilder people. And
yeah, I think that would be a good question to ask them. I've seen once one video of one famous acharya from the lineage, from the Govardhan math that they have in Jagannath Puri, one of the four main maths of the Shankara Sampradaya. And these verses were brought to his attention, and he was not saying too much, to be honest. Actually, he mentioned something like, we consider that that's an interpolation. But also, yeah, there is not much more explanation about that from their side, from that particular case that I know. Again, they may be maybe sharing some other arguments, but those are clear verses from all the extant versions of Padma Purana if one does some like impartial research, if you will.
Well, yeah, that's the question, because if you want to say it's interpolation, there should be a different nature to how the Sanskrit is composed, or it should appear in some manuscripts but not in others. There should be some evidence to support it. If they just want to say it's an interpolation because it doesn't support their worldview, that's a little bit too convenient.
Yeah, of course, that was a reply in one particular lecture that someone asked, and he only said that. With this, I'm not saying that none of them have done any research and tried to prove how that is actually an interpolation according to their own view. I mean, we should make further research in that connection. Of course, that's not only the main point that Vaishnava or others will have to in relation to speaking about impersonalism. That's just one specific quote, since the followers of Shankara do not even, lay much importance to texts like the Puranas themselves, but mostly based on the Vedanta and the commentary on Vedanta made by Shankaracharya, as we will see now. So there are some points, main points, problematic points, if you will, that come in that particular commentary, which Vaishnavas will argue too, if you will.
One of my hermeneutical understandings for approaching the Vedas, inspired by lectures I've heard from Radhika Raman Prabhu, is he used the words can't remember which particular books in the Vedas he was talking about, but he said they're not going to incriminate themselves. So one of our hermeneutical approaches is to say the parts of the book that say Shiva is the supreme, they're given for people in the mode of ignorance so that they can have faith in Shiva, and that's beneficial for them because it's better to have faith in something than to have no path. But those particular books are not going to incriminate themselves. They're not going to say, oh, by the way, we're just telling you this for your own benefit. It's not actually the absolute truth. But then if we look at the Vedas in toto, we'll see those books saying Shiva's supreme, but then we'll see other part of the Vedas saying these section of the Vedas, they're actually not where you're going to get the absolute truth with 100% accuracy. This Bhagavatam is where it's at.
Yeah, and specifically a very interesting, detailed presentation in that connection was done by Srila Jiva Goswami, which is the main theologian of the Gauḍīya school, in one of his treatises called Tattva Sandarbha, which is the first of 6 treatises where he establishes the epistemology according to our particular tradition, and he starts to analyze these sections in scripture, which is say Shiva is supreme, Kṛṣṇa is supreme, whoever, Indra is supreme, and how to properly understand these sections in context, which is what the Vedanta says in the very beginning. And Vedanta says, Atattva Brahma Jignasa, Janmadhyasya Ayata, Shastriyo Nitvat Tattu Samambayat. One has to inquire into Brahman, who is the source of everything. The scriptures are the womb which give birth to that Brahman, to that knowledge of Brahman, and then Tattu Samambayat. But all this has to be properly reconciled and understood in context. Because if not, the scriptures may be like different sounds that are pointing in different directions, but that's only when you are missing the bigger picture. If not, you will find what you mentioned. Of course, as you said, both in Radhika Raman Prabhu, the Vedas won't incriminate themselves. So they are instilling faith in every person according to the degree of faith. The Vedas are described as a kalpa vriksha, or the wish-fulfilling tree, which means, whatever it's your intention or level of consciousness when approaching the Veda, whatever desires you have, the Veda will satisfy them accordingly. But that doesn't mean that because that's satisfied, that's the ultimate truth, if you will.
Right.
So
I mean,
every person will be considered in their particular situation, and from there trying to be inspired to gradually purify themselves and reach deeper levels of conception. That's also present into the proposal, if you will, of the Veda.
Someone could interpret what you just said as meaning the Vedas are totally subjective and you'll just get whatever you want out of it. But I guess the answer to that would be that if you approach the Vedas saying, I want a worldview that looks like this, or I just want this particular thing, anything other than saying, I just want to know the truth, I just want the highest spiritual goal, then you'll get what you're asking for. But if you go asking for the highest truth, asking for the highest goal, the Vedas will also give you that. So it's not totally subjective. You can get objective spiritual truth from it.
Yeah, and I will say also that if you approach the Veda with a sheer material sense of need, I mean, I want this, please give me this, or approach God, give me this, the Veda will fulfill that desire. So the result of that approach will be for us not so much that we receive what we desired, but the real fruit of that approach will be that our faith in the Veda will be increased, because we will feel, oh, by doing what the Veda recommended me to attain my fruit, I did it and it worked. So this Veda works. So your faith in the Veda increases, and by of your faith, next time you approach the Veda with increased faith, that will take you to another layer on deeper way of interpreting the Veda. So you will be able to get closer and closer to the ultimate purpose of the Veda, which was not about, of course, material acquisition or anything.
Right. So with regard to the impersonalism and impersonalism Vedanta debate and commentary, there's two focuses we could have. One is philosophical. Well, I guess there's the third one. We kind of touched a little bit on the Shastric support, what the Vedas actually say on the subject. If you take the Vedas as authoritative, which view is more supported by the Vedas. The other two focuses would be philosophical arguments. So if we analyze with reasoning and pick them apart philosophically, arguments for or against either idea. And the third way we could look at it is what's the benefit or harm that comes from different versions of these different philosophies. So maybe we could say a little bit on philosophical arguments. Like, I quite like in philosophy what in Western philosophy they tend to call construction arguments, which is what you could call an argument Prabhupada often use, that the source of reality has to have all of the qualities that reality has and more in order for it to be able to create. So if God is the source of all of our existences and we have personality, God must also have a personality.
Yeah. Kind of as a reply to that, can I share a few words about theistic non-dualism? Because that's kind of in connection to that, to create the contrast with radical non-dualism. Yeah. So again, we are speaking about non-dualism in both of the cases, but in the case of theistic non-dualism, the understanding is, okay, the absolute is non-dual awareness, non-dual consciousness, and according to the Bhagavad Purana, which is one of the main texts for theistic non-dualism, the most fundamental aspects of reality are basically two, which is reality is non-dual and reality is conscious. That's called Advai Gyan Tattva. Tattva means reality, Advai means non-dual, and Gyan means, in this case, consciousness. So absolute reality is non-dual, but that doesn't mean that nothing else exists, that there's only one homogeneous substance or something. The word non-dual indicates two things. First, the absolute is self-existent. It exists for itself, in itself, as Hegel will say, and which is it's grounded in itself and depends on no external support. And second, that reality is non-dual means that nothing else can exist independent of this non-dual reality support. So interestingly, the word advai in Sanskrit, which means non-dual, includes the word dvai, which means duality. So duality is there, but it's not self-existent. It doesn't have a support in itself. So only non-dual reality is self-existent. That's there, and there's only one of that, of course. So my point is that theistic non-dualism proposes that everything is God, in the sense that whatever is God, whatever that exists is God and his different energies. In that sense, we can say we are non-duals, even us, monotheistic religions. No? God is one, everything is one, everything is God, because all whatever exists is God and his different Shaktis in Sanskrit energies, which are inseparable from him. In that sense, everything is non-different from that one non-dual reality. But at the same time, there's difference. There is place for difference and individuality. Like, for example, us being souls, in a way that does not compromise the foundational non-dualism of reality. The example given sometimes is that of the sun and the rays. It's rays. The sun is one, the rays are something different. You cannot speak in terms of the rays entered the room, while the sun did not enter the room, but at the same time, you can speak about sun and rays as one same thing. So it's interesting because radical non-dualism, they will speak about Brahman as the only reality. But the very definition of Brahman comes from the root brimhati, which means that which grows, or that which is in constant expansion, evolution, development, which does not admit any limitation at all. So that's it, a little bit connected to your point. If the absolute is to be described as the most ideal, perfect reality, it cannot be limited to not having a form, not having any quality, only being impersonal. I understand and I appreciate that probably most of the impersonalists describe the ultimate reality as without form, without name, because they feel form limits, qualities limits, individuality limits. So we don't want to limit the absolute, so it has no form, no qualities. But by doing that, they are limiting the absolute. So the ideal definition of the absolute should be there's no limitation. That's the very meaning of Brahman. So if there's no limitation, reality must be impersonal and personal at the same time. It's not that it's limited to be one thing nor the other, because that will contradict the very notion of unlimited or infinite. So, and interestingly, when you go to the scriptures in India, the Advaita Vedanta, when they speak about Brahman, they are not necessarily referring to impersonal reality. For example, Taittiriya Upanishad mentions Prasuvaisaha. Brahman is a sacred aesthetic rapture, if you will. Kṛṣṇa says in the Gita, Brahmano hi pratishtaham. I'm the foundation of this impersonal Brahman. Then he will say, Klesha dikata rashtisam abhyakta shakta chetasam. Those who have their minds attached to the impersonal feature go through so many problems, basically. Then the Bhagavad Purana will speak about Purna Brahma, or the Para Brahma, the fullest face of Brahma, the complete Brahman, which has to do with the absolute, including impersonal features, but personal as well. So the reason why, because someone may say, okay, but in the scriptures, in the Indian Hindu scriptures, there are so many sections which say God has no name, God has no form, God has no quality. But also we find so many sections which say the opposite. God has unlimited forms, unlimited names, unlimited qualities. So the conclusion is, again, understanding the scripture in context, those sections we say there is no name, there is no form in the absolute means he has no material name, material form and name as we used to think of them in our particular situation. But it's not that having a form necessarily limits. Of course, our experience of form may be limiting, but there's place for something we may call spiritual form. Or even, we can say, even in this world, interestingly, just to go to some immediate empirical experience, form can be a facilitator and not necessarily an obstacle. For example, if you're an artist and you have some inherent inspiration to express, you need a form, a canvas, and so many other forms to express your art. So the form of the canvas is not limiting your expression, but is actually increasing it, enhancing it, facilitating it. So in the same way, there is a place, even from our experience here, that form can facilitate and not limit. So what to speak, if that's our experience, how much this same principle could apply to the absolute. So the word nirvishesh in Sanskrit, which means devoid of quality or variety, again, is used mostly in the scriptures to deny mundane attributes in the absolute, in Brahman, but not to negate all qualities in themselves, only mundane qualities, temporary as we perceive them. Because interestingly, and this is again, some contradictions may start to come in in the presentation of impersonalism, the followers of Adi Shankara will mention that Brahman has the quality of nityatva, for example, which means eternity, or vibhutva, or omni-penetration. There are qualities, and at the same time they will say Brahman is nirguna, quality-less. So while they present an absolute devoid of qualities, somehow they cannot avoid speaking about some qualities attached to it, because again, the nature of the absolute is it can have qualities, and that's not a limiting aspect. On the contrary. So, and what Sankara has done regarding what you were mentioning, interestingly, in this connection is Sankaracharya gave importance only to those statements in the scriptures which emphasize oneness alone, while he treated the statements advocating variety as secondary, but without giving any satisfactory explanation or reason for that. So putting them in the background, if you will. So there are some ideas in that connection, and of course also some of the non-dualists, because theism sometimes is, for many, automatically equated with dualism by many people, and they will consider that as inferior. Oh, you have God here, the world there, or whatever, God and something else, and they will consider this dualistic. And some people will, from the schools of non-dualism especially, will advocate this is a higher understanding when there is no dualism, everything is Brahman. The highest state of the transpersonal, they conclude through conventional logic, again, it's non-personal. But again, this is a point where logic breaks down, because the logic will exhaust itself at the doorway of Brahman, so to say, and won't allow further penetration into transcendence, allowing variety in this unity, expanded non-duality that can accommodate distinction in oneness. So my conclusion in this connection, before turning to other points, is like both impersonal and personal schools of Vedanta agree that reality is ontologically non-dual, but they differ on how that non-duality ultimately plays itself out. So even in connection to impersonalism, as we can see also, there are different even perspectives as well. I mean, we allow in our monotheistic tradition for the possibility of an impersonal experience, while that doesn't mean that ultimately reality is impersonal. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've got that was very interesting. I've got a few comments on some of the points you made. I've taken a few notes. So the point about how an artist finds that using a particular medium to express their art is not limiting. I've heard that described in a very interesting way on a podcast where an artist was describing how they use a very restrictive type of way of making imagery that, I don't know, I can't remember what it was. It was something on a canvas or a picture, but they don't just use any kind of paint or pastels, or that they feel like that they do something, they limit themselves to something very specific. And they actually find when they do that, they've got less options, so they can just focus more on expressing themselves and less on figuring out what kind of medium they want to use. So what is seemingly a limit actually turns out to facilitate the creative process even more. So I think one of our main focuses here, as in terms of how we differ from impersonalistic schools, what we might want to say about them is they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So they're saying, oh, personalities have egos clash, egos have problems, relationships have problems, people fight, existence that has forms and these different things, ultimately it leads to so much suffering. Better to have no forms, no people, no ego, lose the whole thing. That's like a spiritual suicide, and then we won't have any of the suffering. But what we want to say is, I'll compare this to an analogy of women who have had bad experience with men and just decide all men are bad. I don't want any men in my life. And of course, some men are bad, and men can have bad qualities. But that doesn't mean the solution is to get rid of men completely. The solution is to get rid of the bad qualities, or at least manage the bad qualities. And ultimately, the goal would be to have relationships between people in the world full of good qualities where we don't have those problems. So to apply that, I think it's pretty clear how that analogy applies to the spiritual context here of, that the form, they want to say, a form is limiting. So if God has a form, that limits him. And we want to say God can both have a form and have other forms and be impersonal all at the same time. And it's inconceivable, it's mysterious. And this enables God to express himself fully, to relate with each particular bhakta in a personal way with there's various different forms he has. And this is the least limiting of all. But when we think of limits, we just think of them, like the woman who hates men. She's had bad experience with men in the past, and she just projects that onto all men. So the impersonalist who's had bad experience with forms just projects that onto all forms and doesn't imagine that God could have a form devoid of those bad qualities, which brings me to another point, which is we use the word material all the time, like, it's still a form, it's still full of qualities, but it's not material. Now, a Christian or Western philosopher might be confused by our use of the word material here, because often, like in a Christian context, when they're talking about material, they mean a form, they mean qualities. And when they say non-material, that like they'll often think angels are just like some kind of personality devoid of form. Like, I don't know really how that works. It's kind of inconceivable. But if you listen to the stories of describing angels in the Bible, or maybe we think of them as demigods or asuras, but they sound like they have forms. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, of course. Why not?
So what I'm getting to is we should define what we mean by material. What's the dichotomy we're drawing between material and non-material, but still having qualities?
Yeah, and I can understand, as you mentioned, how delicate and how difficult, we could say, is not for us not to project whatever experience we have had till now to whatever lies beyond our experience, because that what lies beyond our experience, by definition, is out of our reach, according to our present experience. So, of course, for that to be in place, we need some experience of that other side, if you will, to at least start to open ourselves to the possibility that even the way we conceive of limits is in itself limited. Now, we may think or speak about something being limited while not noticing that we are limited while speaking about limits. So the way we are projecting that is already flawed in itself. So like the example you gave, or another example that comes to my mind, is this one of the toothache. Now you have a toothache, and of course you can cure that, or you can just take the tooth out and there's no more pain, but there's no more teeth also, no? So you lost the pain, but you lost the capacity to use your mouth in full range. So sometimes the notion of impersonalism may be connected with this in relation to, as you mentioned, no? I've been suffering a lot, and I want to stop suffering. I mean, that's something that most people is completely into it. No, I mean, I don't want to suffer, so how to stop suffering? I mean, and that's why more people actually, if you hear about the proposition of impersonalism, it makes perfect sense for many, because I would say also, before going to the suffering issue in detail, recently I was hearing someone who mentioned something interesting. He said that most of us, not all of us, but most of us, somehow unconsciously, generally, yearn for a return to an undifferentiated consciousness, which was represented by the simplicity of life in the womb. So many of us in the life in the womb experience some sort of undifferentiated merging into the mother identity. That's the consciousness of a baby. Still is not even aware that he's an individual. And that gave some sort of peace, if you will. And subconsciously, some people is wanting to go back to that experience because of so much suffering. And because of that, the proposition of Advaita Vedanta also make lots of sense. And again, it's very close to the idea also of nirvana in Buddhism, which the Buddha himself said, world is made of suffering. Suffering comes from attachment. So get rid of attachment, get rid of suffering. Of course, in the context of that, also you get rid of your own sense of individual existence. So for many people, because impersonalism speaks a lot about oneness and unity. So most of the people is experiencing this world, when they hear the word difference or variety, they translate that as a conflict. No? Like difference of opinion, variety, they don't think that can add nuance, harmony, but that's like a clash. And so for them, unity and oneness translates as peace, if you will. So for them, the notion of the ultimate oneness is the ultimate peace. But of course, as you mentioned, for us, that's not the end of the story. There can be peace, but there can be diversity also, and God can honor and accommodate diversity. No, he's not threatened by differences. It's we who are threatened by difference, and sometimes. but above that, there's how to say something else that integrates the best of both diversity and peace, which is love. You know, we will call it unity and diversity. So for us, love is, I mean, impersonal realization basically does not include the possibility of loving interaction. Because there's nobody else to relate to. There's no sense of self. There's nobody else. So in that sense, it's also counterintuitive to our daily immediate experience as individuals of having experiences. I mean, there is no experience in Brahman. That's an interesting point, because many of the followers may think we will experience this, we will experience that. So they still think in terms of I will be experiencing something else. But the actual philosophy is there for them is there's only Brahman. There's nobody else experiencing something else. That will create diversity in a total non-dual reality. So it's funny because many people who follow Advaita Vedanta are not actually aware of the implications of it when you play out them, which is there will be no experience whatsoever. So you cannot even put to words what's that state, basically. So I will say that one of the basic problems of radical non-dualism is that there's no ultimate ontological existence of us as individuals, and that won't allow for the experience of love and interaction, and that doesn't allow for any experience whatsoever. No, so that's one thing, and as you mentioned, the idea of how people understand material and immaterial or non-material and incorporeal, if you will. Again, that's a semantic point that it's important to clarify whenever we have these conversations to begin with. No, so yeah, we can conceive of something material as with form, and then our logic goes then, okay, something non-material must have no form. But again, that's our logic. And we cannot grasp God, the absolute reality, through logic itself. So he's quite beyond that, and he allows for the possibility of form that is not limiting, form that is spiritual, non-material, and so on. Those exist in the range of possibilities of divinity, basically, although they transcend empirical experience for sure. So as you mentioned, in one sense, pure monism, which is the doctrine of impersonalism, is basically the same as Buddhist nihilism, because when everything becomes one, there ceases to be any subject or object. Again, the experiencer and the experienced have dissolved into experience itself, if you will. Like sometimes that's described as absolutely deep sleep, basically, eternal in this case, deep sleep. So, some ideas. I don't know if you want to share something on that.
Right, yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what we mean by material. So perhaps we should talk about what the Sanskrit translation would be. What Sanskrit words are used in the text, which we translate as material versus spiritual. Would it be antaranga versus bahiranga Shakti?
Well, antaranga, bahiranga means like external and internal, not necessarily are same material. No, antaranga means internal, bahiranga means external. A word that could fit that was the word prakriti, but interestingly, as you may know, Sanskrit works in a way that the same word can refer to many things. So prakriti can also mean nature, which somehow is connected to the material for many people when you speak about nature. But prakriti can refer to material reality. Of course, it can also refer to spiritual reality. So the very fact that the same word applies to both, depending the context, which again is crucial, also speaks about how what we find in one place is not necessarily the opposite of what we find in the other place. If we can use the word prakriti to define material, and we can use the word prakriti to define transcendental, somehow hints at the possibility that although they are categorically different, one and the other, still by using the same word, it's pointing they are not as different as we may think through our own logical process, basically. In other words, you have forms here in this prakriti, you can have form there's with the other prakriti, daivim prakritim, Kṛṣṇa calls in the Gita, transcendence, daivim prakritim. So by material, again, we refer to one particular, in the Hindu tradition or in our Vaishnava tradition, there is a lot of talk about Shakti, no, or energy or potency. So there are different departments of that, mostly divided in three of them. As you say, Bahiranga, Antaranga, and in between them, if you want to put it like that, although we cannot locate them like geographically, it's us, no, Jiva Shakti or Tatastha Shakti. Shakti means potency. So material basically means one department, one energetic department of God, which deals with a particular energy that is in constant flux and movement. It doesn't have the qualities of transcendence, of being something immutable, conscious, full of bliss, and so on. Sachit Ananda, sometimes we may call, but matter is mostly described as Asat, Achit, Nirananda, which means temporary, inert, and not possessing in itself ananda or bliss in its own constitution. Although we may think there is bliss in material elements, we are just projecting our search for bliss and projecting what we already are in those particular elements.
One way I like to think of the difference between matter and spirit is intentional, it's full of intentionality. So in the spiritual world, it's described that even the grass is a particular jiva. Everything has a personality behind it. Yeah. Whereas matter is mechanistic. There's no intentionality. It's just following an algorithm, you could say. We could describe the laws of physics as algorithms that determine the course of certain events. What do you think of that dichotomy?
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. Again, like because again, you are mentioning this idea of the grass in what we call the spiritual world being a conscious entity, which again is a very interesting idea. Here we are not only speaking about spiritual form, but fully conscious grass, if you will. Scriptures say, "Vaikuntara Prithiviyadi Sakal Chinmaya," which is from transcendence, from transcendence upwards, if you will, in all the different degrees of penetration into transcendence. Even the dust is transcendental subject entities. So everything is consciousness taking different shapes. Again, the shape of a tree, the shape of grass. So that's another way of conceiving that, no? Like consciousness takes shape, no? And the shapes are made of that conscious substance, which again, for that we need to go beyond the three-dimensional way of perceiving things. While by contrast, as you mentioned, here matter won't have that type of initiative or agency or volition out of itself, if you will. Of course, in another sense, matter is, in our tradition, there is also a description of God's presence in every atom, because of course, by definition, God has one of these many omnis, one of them being omnipresence. So he's omnipresent. So we could say in every atom of matter, God is present. We will speak about that form as Shirodakasai Vishu in our tradition. So of course that God is present in every atom doesn't mean that there is a jiva in our terms, a specific individual soul inhabiting that atom. But at the same time, we can speak about God's presence there, because again, he's by definition omnipresent. So although one sense we say matter is inert and mechanistic, in the sense that there is not a particular soul, individual soul with individual agency and volition, at the same time we can consider the presence of God by his very omnipresence in each particular atom, which of course somehow, I don't want to say makes it alive, but of course makes it existent and real and sustained and so on. So there's some movement there as well. No? So that's an interesting combination of facts, I would say.
Yeah, when you were talking about the significance of the Sanskrit word prakriti or prakriti, referring to both spiritual and material natures, I was thinking of how perhaps a good way of coming at it is to talk about how when we say material, we really mean a state of mind. So for the pure devotee who's fully spiritual realized, there is no material world. Everything is connected to God somehow or other. Everyone is in a relationship with God. There's at a sufficiently advanced level, everyone is seen as a devotee. Everything is seen as God's energy and so on. And it's just, so material energy is actually a product of us having a false perception of being separate from God.
Yeah, totally agree. We could say material energy is an energetic department that will activate for those who choose to approach reality with a separatistic or exploitative nature. But if you don't have that particular approach, that particular consciousness, there's no need of that influence, of that material energy. And as you mentioned, for someone, even in this world, who is perfectly aligned with transcendence, there's nothing material to be perceived. Everything is seen as what it is, which is in connection to its source. We have that term in Sanskrit called sambandha. Sambandha means everything, and bandha means tied or connected. So sambandha means the knowledge that shows us how everything is connected to a common center, to a common source. And then comes avideya, which is the practice that comes out of that knowledge, and prayojan, the fruit of that. So we have the example of, in our tradition, of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, who he will say, see any sand dune or any extension of water, and he will be immediately transported ecstatically to different sacred spots in transcendence, if you will. So that's the potential. Some traditions will speak in terms of jivan mukta or some other ideas that you are in this world, in this body, but beyond that, in the sense beyond material influence, if you will, because you are actually understanding what's the body, what's this world, and how everything, again, is energy. We are energy, the world is energy, and all of them share a common energetic source. So just to be, even you don't need to be super advanced in a mystical tradition and having lots of epiphany, if you will. If you have very clear knowledge about how everything around you is an energy of the Supreme, and start to relate to that on the base of that knowledge, in one sense, you are already beyond the influence, the material influence. There's no need for that, because you are not approaching that, again, in a taking spirit, but in a dedicating, linking spirit. That's religion, that's yoga, again.
So the next thing to talk about, I guess, would be different kinds of impersonalism or non-dualism. And to lead into that subject, I could say something about, what was I going to say? A philosophical objection to impersonalism, which is, I heard it explained quite nicely by Radhika Raman Prabhu on where the mystery is placed. So in any worldview, there's going to be something where it's like, we can explain all these things, but there's one quote, I should have got it ready, that modern science functions on the principle of grant us one miracle and then we can explain everything else. So just give us the Big Bang and all that matter and all the laws of physics and everything, and then we'll explain everything else. I don't know if that's quite true. I heard Advaita Swami explain quite nicely how for the atheistic worldview based on materialism, they attribute inconceivable potency to matter. So basically, everywhere you point your microscope, there's a complete mystery that we don't have an explanation for. And I think you find the materialistic atheistic worldview and the radical non-dualism philosophically have a surprising amount in common, because the radical non-dualists, they also place the mystery in the world. They just frame it a little bit differently, but it ends up with the same positioning of the mystery. Because for the radical non-dualist, there is no variety, there is no forms, none of this actually exists. So then the mystery is, why are we having an experience of there being all this variety if it doesn't exist? So the mystery is placed in the world. Whereas for the personalist, for the theist, we place the mystery in God, and then you get this crazy being who's full of all qualities in an inconceivable way, we are one with, and the world is one with in an inconceivable way. But his existence, we can't explain God. God's a mystery. That's to be expected of a being who's the foundation of reality. But once you accept this Bhagavat being, then you can explain everything else.
Yeah, well, you opened the door for many points, which I appreciate. That's great. I mean, you invoked the word mystery, and for me, that's one of my favorite words when speaking about transcendence, because I really like to speak in terms of mystery in our own tradition. I mean, in Christian, mystics speak a lot about mystery and the cloud of unknowing, and how God cannot ultimately be grasped. And we ourselves also have terms like that. No? Rahasya, in the Gita, Krishna speaks about Raja Guhyam, the king of secrets. He says of all secrets some silence, and Rahasya, divine love, is the greatest secret. So he speaks a lot about secret and mystery, and I think we, in our particular tradition, and we have so much information about God in detail, but that can be tricky as well, because we can fall into an overdose of certainty, some toxic certainty, like I know everything about God. And still he remains a mystery, as you mentioned, because still he's absolute, and still he can make your head spin as he did with Brahma. So it's important that we remain humble and open to the notion that although I may know all that I know about God, which still is just a little bit compared to all that I do not know, he remains a mystery above all. So regarding the notion of Advaitavadis or impersonalists positing the world as a mystery, yes, in one sense, although they will say, as you may imagine, that the world does not exist, technically speaking. I mean, that's an illusion as well, because the only thing that exists is Brahman. So then we come, and I will be maybe mixing some things here, because you have asked me also to speak about different forms of impersonalism, but then you threw me into the mystery lands, and I love that, so I will go there for a minute. But the Advaitavadis is one of the philosophical problems, I will say probably the biggest in their proposal, because they indulge in a huge logical fallacy, which is one of the main problems again, which is they say, okay, according to their philosophy, everything is Brahman. Technically speaking, there's nothing else apart from Brahman. If you, of course, you may say, as you mentioned, so if nothing else is apart from Brahman, why am I experiencing myself as an individual? Why am I experiencing the world? So many things apart from Brahman that are being experienced. How that can happen if everything is Brahman? And they will say, that's because of Maya. So they will introduce the notion of Maya. But of course, if they say that, then the next question will be, but if everything that exists really is only Brahman, where does Maya come from? How something else can exist if ultimately only Brahman is real? And if only Brahman is real, how can not only Maya exist, but how can Maya cover Brahman? You follow? Because if we are Brahman, if everything is Brahman, but we do not realize that because of the influence of Maya, how can Maya not only exist separately from Brahman, but cover Brahman? And they have no substantial, reasonable answer to this.
And that's why we call them Mayavad.
Yeah, that was basically the idea. So of course, again, Sankara may have thought it necessary to reinterpret the view of the scriptures in order to legitimize and stress whatever, the non-dual nature of the absolute. But in doing so, he introduced this strategic error, I will say, that he ultimately undermined his whole system, that the Brahman is becoming overwhelmed by Maya. And it is for this reason, as you mentioned, that sometimes his doctrine is rightly referred to as Mayavad. because Maya, which is said by Shankar to be devoid of ontological reality, because everything is Brahman for him, nothing else exists in reality. So there's no ontological reality to Maya, but somehow Maya is able to overcome Brahman, which is the one and only real substance and ultimate reality. So this is quite problematic. For example, a few examples of that. For Maya to be involved with Brahman, I mean, either Brahman will have to be downgraded to Maya's empirical level, because they say only Maya operates on an empirical level, but Brahman is beyond that. So for Maya to be involved with Brahman, Brahman would have to be downgraded to Maya's empirical level. So Brahman could be, if you will, adulterated by Maya material designations, or else Maya will have to be upgraded to the ontological level of Brahman, so that Maya could influence Brahman. And of course, the first alternative is impossible, Brahman being downgraded to the empirical level, because again, according to the impersonalists, Brahman is without attributes and therefore cannot change, cannot become affected. And the second alternative, Maya being upgraded to the level of Brahman, will amount to dualism, because then you have Maya and Brahman both having equal status on the plane of ontological reality. And of course, this contradicts the basic premise of non-dualism, because now you have two permanent entities. So my point is that that's a very huge problem. And they try to introduce that idea to justify their notion of Advaita Vedanta. But again, trying not to limit the unlimited, the only thing they end up doing is limiting him more and more. So, yeah, sorry.
Makes me think of the classic objection that Hare Krishnas, I've even heard of Christians using similar things when they've come across impersonalists in exchanges of if everything's one, then my pocket, your pocket's the same thing, so give me your wallet. Right? And I heard of one case where a book distributor actually managed to convince the guy to hand him his wallet, and he came back later in the day to retrieve his wallet. Right? Or there's a funny example of everything's all the same, right? So ripe mango, rotten mango, right? Like Srila Bhaktisiddhanta didn't eat mangoes because of a particular vow he took. So his disciples wouldn't eat mangoes too, because the guru's not eating mangoes. So they're traveling on the bus and they've got all these rotten mangoes because people were giving it to them. And they convinced the Mayavadi, who's saying everything's all the same, to eat one of the rotten mangoes because it's all the same. There's no differentiation. And these are just some typical objections that'll be given against certain forms of impersonalism, which are quite fun.
Yeah, of course, as we are developing the idea, no? Although reality is one, and it's important to establish that non-dual foundation again, so we are not having a dualistic foundation for life. On top of that non-dual foundation, as we mentioned, and we will develop, there's the possibility for diversity, which on the basis of non-foundational. So yeah, I can give you my wallet as long as you have it clear that all of us belong to a non-dual foundation, and you will use my money for the same purpose. I will use your money for the same non-dual idea. As long as you don't have that non-dual foundation in place, I cannot give you my wallet. Sorry. Yeah, I don't have a wallet as a sannyasi in itself. But anyhow, yeah, I get your point of how these ideas may be exploited. Should I share some words about the different forms of impersonalism that you invited me to?
Yeah, because when we give that wallet objection to some Christians who like Shankaracharya's view, they'll say, oh, that's a straw man. And then when I've had exchanges with some of these Christians who like Adi Shankaracharya's view, some of them have studied the works of Rambachan. Do you know him?
I don't know.
He's got a devotional name too. He's done some translations of Adi Shankaracharya's works, and I've also heard Garuda Prabhu comment on it and say some of the stuff that Prabhupada commented on and that in ISKCON we talk about, they're actually commentaries on Adi Shankaracharya from some of his more zealous followers. And if you actually go back to the original Sanskrit, it's not quite as extreme or radical. And so but what I think he's doing is translating Adi Shankaracharya with his own interpretation of. I'm going to be hosting an interview between him and Garuda Prabhu at some point, so we can discuss that. But yeah, I think what they're doing is they're having their own understanding of Adi Shankaracharya, what he taught, that is devoid of some of these logical fallacies, rather than an accurate representation. But yeah, I think what they're doing is they're having their own understanding of Adi Shankaracharya, what he taught, that is devoid of some of these logical fallacies, rather than an accurate representation. But yeah, I think what they're doing is they're having their own understanding of Adi Shankaracharya, what he taught, that is devoid of some of these logical fallacies, rather than an accurate representation. But Just the fact that some people disagree with that view. Oh yeah, what I was getting at is I think that they'll say they believe in this kind of non-dualism, but then when you give certain objections to them, like, okay, if there's this radical non-dualism, if that's the case, then there can't be me and God, various other points that you made, and then they'll just start talking about what we talk about. There's oneness and difference. It's like, then why are you calling it non-dualism? Like it's like a kind of impersonalism in name only, and impersonalism in like, this is from Adi Shankaracharya, but really I think they've given their own slant to it. So I think you get those types as well.
Yeah, that's what we say before, that many people, and of course not only with Advaita Vedanta, it can happen with any tradition, that we can officially present ourselves as impersonalists or personalists or this or that, but we are not fully able to play out the implications of what does it mean to subscribe to that particular doctrine. So sometimes we say, I'm this, and someone will play out the implications of that, and we may somehow start to explain away our own affiliation by contradicting the core premises of that, like you are mentioning. I can say, I'm impersonalist, but you say something else, and then you introduce the notion of diversity and this and that, which somehow, again, go against the original premise. So it's important that whatever is our affiliation, if you will, we are expert in playing out the implications of the core values that we are following. So we still remain there, or know why we remain there, and know how to explain that. So in connection to that, let me introduce this idea of different forms of impersonalism, because of course, as we have seen, followers of radical non-dualism, they consider there's only Brahman and everything is false, as problematic as that it is, as we have hinted at. While on the other side, followers of theistic non-dualism, monotheism, they do not agree with this postulate, but also, nonetheless, they accept the possibility of merging in Brahman as one of the many forms of mukti described in the scriptures. That's called Sayuja Mukti, or Ekatva. So Brahman, because Brahman is one of the three aspects of the Absolute according to the Vedas. Brahmati Paramatmeti Bhagavaniti Shabdyate. Although, interestingly, the way to think about this, also because we may think, okay, Brahman is here, Paramatma is there, Bhagavan is there, but again, you are creating duality by thinking like that. We are speaking about one non-dual substance, which is expressed in different ways. So Jiva Goswami, for example, in his Bhagavad Sandarbha, he will say, Brahman is, as you mentioned, you can be in this world, but in your consciousness be not in a material situation, not in the material world per se. Brahman is a state of consciousness, it's a level of penetration into transcendence. In other words, it's not that the Absolute is devoid of all distinction, but Brahman means the indistinct view of the Absolute. Like an example that I can give you is that of a how do you say in English? Subway. So when you are on the subway waiting for the subway to come, first when it's coming, you see a light in the distance. So it's a subway, but you are seeing it from certain distance. Eventually, it comes closer to you, and you see the wagon, if you will, of the subway. And then the subway opens, and there's people inside, and you can enter, and there is interaction and dynamics. But all of them are the subway, but perceived from different, if you will, distances or perspectives. So we could say Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan, all of them are the Absolute, but Brahman is this distant perception of it that you can just see the light, basically. So that's the monotheistic view on impersonal attainment. So there is a possibility of that, of attaining that light, but which doesn't mean that everything is Brahman. There is the ultimate non-duality. It's just some people want to connect with that particular phase of the Absolute. Of course, in contrast to that, the radical non-dualistic impersonal view, as you may mention, Sankara, or at least some of his followers, for them there is no point even in speaking about merging, because for them the soul and everything else is nothing ultimately but Brahman. There's no soul for them. There's no world. There's nobody to merge in someone else. So for them, it is even technically wrong to say that one becomes Brahman realize, or that one merges into Brahman, because there is no one else to merge into someone else. For them, there is no actual distinction between oneself and Brahman. So in that sense, there's no exact way to express the final state that they're speak about. But for us, if you will, for a monotheistic Vedantin, we will speak in terms of merging, because for us, the jiva, or the soul, is eternally individual, but chooses to enter into Brahman. Mm-hmm. It's not that for us the jiva is Brahman, no. For us, we won't say that the jiva becomes Brahman, no. But we can say that the jiva can reside there, if you will, eternally, although from the personalist perspective is something undesirable. Mm-hmm. So in conclusion, in this connection, although it is possible to attain an impersonal form of liberation, mukti, monotheistic Hinduism does not equate that with the proposal of radical non-dualism, that everything actually is Brahman, as they say, in every sense of the term, which, by the way, is an idea that has lots of parallels with Buddhism. But I don't know if we have time or you would like to go in that direction, or if not, we can go somewhere else, no problem.
Yeah, we could talk a little bit about that. The analogy that's often given to describe the jiva entering Brahman is a green bird entering a tree, and it disappears, mm-hmm. and then the bird can leave. You said something that might many Hare Krishnas might be a little bit surprised by, that a soul could reside eternally in Brahman, because typically we hear from Prabhupada that impersonal destinations, the soul gets bored there, because the natural nature of the soul is to be active and to serve, and when you merge with Brahman, there's no service. It's kind of like the pleasure of going to sleep. Eventually, it gets boring and you want some action. And we have a particular interpretation of this Buddhist idea of bodhisattva. So that bodhisattva attains this impersonal realization, elevates into the Brahman effulgence, or exactly wherever they go, you could comment on perhaps, and then gets bored and comes back to do welfare activities.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I will say that the bodhisattva is not even willing to go anywhere and get bored there and then return, but actually makes a vow before going anywhere that out of compassion, that person is not willing to go anywhere but return here over and over again till every single soul in this planet will be freed, which of course from our perspective that's not possible, because there are unlimited souls. So it's not that at some point the planet becomes emptied and there's no more work to do and everyone goes to nirvana, if you will. But that's, if you will, something parallel. In connection to what you are mentioning, yes, I know that for some practitioners of Gauḍīya Vaishnavism, what I say may be a surprise, but actually that's what is mentioned in Scripture. This is not something, of course, I'm making up. And why someone like Srila Prabhupada or other spiritual masters have mentioned other things. Interestingly, Srila Prabhupada also mentioned, and I don't have them with me here now, but I have a compilation of quotations where he makes the point that it's possible to attain Brahman and remain there forever. So he will say at some point some other things. I will say mostly in the context of emphasizing how unbecoming that realization is from the perspective of a personalist. And that's why he will kind of discourage that. Also speaking to an audience at a time where the most mainly current an idea about Hinduism, mysticism is Advaita Vedanta. So as we know, Nirvisheshan Yabadi Paschatyadi Satarine, one of the main features of his mission was to make this difference clear. But if you go to the scriptures, it is very clear that one of the different types of mukti is this one, impersonal liberation. So if something is mukti, technically speaking, according to scripture, that's liberation. So you cannot speak about something called liberation that you can fall from. Because what can you make you fall from Brahman? Because there is no sense of identity. Who will fall from where? There is no influence of Maya there. So how can you fall? Of course, again, we can make some explanations to make it more didactic, but actually, technically speaking, you are beyond the influence of the gunas, the material modes of nature. There's nothing that can make you fall, and there's no sense of individuality. So there's nobody falling from anywhere. So basically, there are many quotes in Shastra in this connection. And I remember I made a whole podcast with Navrasa Prabhu about that, about the fall of the jiva. And not only did I address that particular point, but also the idea that one may fall from Vaikuntha or the spiritual world, but also we touch upon Brahman, whether if we come from there or if we go there, if one falls from there and so on. But the point is there's no fall from there because, again, there's nothing that can make you fall. And there's nobody to fall from there because there's no sense of identity. So that's basically the Shastric perspective, what scriptures are saying.
We can put a link to that podcast in the video description if people want to hear more detail on that. Okay, cool. Do you want to carry on?
Yeah, where to go? Some connection with Buddhism, since we invoked some words about that.
We can talk a little bit about Buddhism. I've got a lot of notes that somebody helped me compile on how in Buddhism you have personalism. There's certain schools of Buddhism, I think it might be Mahayana, where they talk about the Buddha as kind of like what we would call in Hare Krishna the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and they chant his name, and they think that, and we're currently in a dark age, and in this dark age the best practice is chanting the name of the Buddha.
Yeah, so that's pretty interesting, and of course I agree with that. When we say Buddhism, when we say Hinduism, as we explained at the beginning, some may say Hinduism and think, okay, polytheism, okay, Advaita Vedanta, but each way more nuanced than what we may think from the distance. So the same applies not only to Buddhism, but with any tradition. So yeah, in the case of Buddhism, we have a personalist side, but of course I want to share some words, since we are speaking mostly in this case about impersonal direction, which is the connection between radical non-dualism and Buddhism, and the main expression of Buddhism, which may not necessarily be in the direction of personalism. So as we mentioned before, interestingly, in this quote from Padma Purana, this radical non-dual Vedanta is described as veiled Buddhism. What Sankaracharya came to give was described in the scriptures as veiled Buddhism. So there must be some connection between the two. And in one sense, even for many, the gulf between Advaita Vedanta Buddhism is almost considered as semantic, basically. For example, let me share some few common points between the two. For example, Buddha will say the world is sunya tattva. Sunya tattva means non-existent. And in all three phases of time, past, present, future. Sankara will say the world is mithya, which means false, which means non-existence. In all, and it's lacking of past, present, and future. So again, you have the very same point. Or Buddhism will say that the way to attain nirvana is through prajna paramita, or knowledge of reality. So you can understand the world is full of suffering. And impersonalism will say tattva gyan, or knowledge of reality, is a method to attain moksha, which is, again, the same method, basically. Or Buddhists will speak about sunya, which is their goal, like emptiness, and that is being manobacham agochara, which means non being able to be described by mind or words. Impersonalists will say the same about Brahman. Or, I don't know, liberation in Buddhism is conceived as the elimination of samvriti, or the veil of illusion. And Advaita Vedanta is the elimination of avidya, which is ignorance. And something else that comes to mind is that both the Brahman of the Advaitavadis and the Sunya of the Buddhists have no attributes. So if these two things have no attributes, are identical, basically. So it's interesting because they are extremely similar, but in a way, Sankara's view, as we mentioned, can be seen as a reaction to, or a counterpart of, the Buddhist doctrine of anatma, which here we have a difference. The Buddhists won't speak about the existence of spirit, at least the impersonal ones. So both of these views somehow establish non-dualism from opposite starting points, if you will. Both are useful in one sense in urging conventional devotion out of its tendency to get stuck in dualism. Again, conventional devotion tends to get stuck in dualism. So something like Buddhism or impersonalism makes a push in that direction. But of course, according to the followers of monotheistic Vedanta, impersonalism presents and Buddhism a good set of problems, as we have already shared. No? But again, there are some similarities to it, at least when we conceive them in terms of impersonalism.
I'm wondering how they differ. I heard Radhika Raman Prabhu give a simplistic commentary saying that Buddha came along and said reality is zero, nothing. And then Adi Shankaracharya came along and said not zero, one. And then Madhvacharya came along and said not zero, not one, but two. And then we have Ramanuja's view, which is not zero, not one, but both one and two.
Sri Chaitanya came and say 108.
So I wonder if there's any... I mean, it sounds cool telling that little story like that. It's nice and simplistic, but is there really some meaning to saying that Buddhism is saying there's zero and Adi Shankaracharya is saying there's one?
Well, again, although it may seem that there's not too much progress from 0 to 1, I will even connect all this to negative numbers, since we are speaking about numbers. Of course, all these traditions are trying to push us outside of the negative experience of material suffering, which could be compared to living in negative numbers, -1, -2. So all those 0 has no value, positive value in itself. If you compare 0 to negative numbers, it has some positive value.
Right.
In comparison with negative numbers.
Right.
And of course, if you say from 0 to 1, there's not much difference, but at the same time, 0 in one sense has no positive value in comparison to 1. So in that sense, we could say the proposal of Shankaracharya is going one step beyond Buddhism, in terms that Buddhism will speak of there's no spirit. Again, I'm not referring to the personalist branch of it. And we'll say that reality ultimately is, it's basically a form of atheism. While Shankaracharya will say, no, there is consciousness, there's reality, but all of that is one thing. So there is some nuance between the two. Again, he's not acknowledging any diversity, any movement in transcendence, but there is some difference between the two, although in many ways, as we mentioned, we can even present them as almost the same.
Yeah.
And again, I'm sure we will speak with different representatives of this school, and not all of them will say the same thing. So there's lots of nuance in between as well. Huh?
Yeah, so they have a lot in common, and obviously there's been a lot of debates back and forth between Buddhism and Buddhism was pretty much philosophically driven out of India by Adi Shankaracharya, and then Adi Shankaracharya's teachings are still debated within the Vedanta schools to this day, right?
Yeah, that's like an eternal debate from time without beginning, basically. Yeah,
and it's also this debate is something you find, I think, in all the world religions. So in Christianity, you have the iconoclasm. They were pretty violent about it, but can you worship a form, or can you not worship a form? And there's different ways these debates come up in different traditions, but it's this another debate you get that's perennial in all the world's traditions is do we have to make it grace versus works? So we say it's a mixture of both, but it's just an aside.
Grace versus works, like personal effort, you meant?
Yeah. Are we responsible for our own salvation, or do we just hop on the train and get strapped in and then not have to do anything?
Yeah. As you know, there are many examples even in our own traditions. The example of the monkey, the example of the cat, where one has to climb up to the mother and the other one is being carried without.
Yeah.
But you have to allow yourself being carried. So still you have something to do. So of course, in our particular tradition, the principle of grace is tremendously emphasized. But as you mentioned, it doesn't do away with our own individuality and volition, because we have to do our part to let divine grace do its own part, if you will. We have to allow that to enter. We have to allow that we speak many times about costless mercy. That's a very classical expression in our tradition, costless mercy. But I would like to say costless mercy doesn't mean priceless mercy. So it doesn't mean that there is no price to pay. It means just that we will never deserve it, no matter what we do. And we can do something, but still we never deserve it. And that's a high price to pay, to coexist with a substance that you will never deserve. I mean, that requires lots of humility. Try to imagine that you want a gift that no matter what you do, you will never deserve. That's a hard pill to swallow for the ego. And that's why many people do not enter in touch with causeless mercy, because they are not willing. They want there to be a cause for this. So I deserve it, because we are addicted to feel that we deserve things. But this meritocracy, if you will. I do this and this happens. I do this. These are like a more formulaic thing where still we feel we are in control. And so my point is, for grace to happen, we should work on ourselves, and that comes the effort part. So we can develop the humility to eternally deal with causeless mercy and not feeling overwhelmed by that. You follow my point?
Yeah, I like the way you describe that, how we can never pay it off, but it's not priceless. We still have to make some effort. As for what you said about humility, but that kind of indebtedness and gratitude, maybe it hurts the ego, but if you can overcome that, that's the grounds for a very deep and meaningful and enriching relationship with God.
Yeah. Interestingly, in our own tradition, and maybe here I'm going to very high grounds, but there's a famous verse in the Bhagavad with Kṛṣṇa himself saying, "Napari ham nirabadhi sanjayansa sadhu kritam vibhudayu sapiban," so on. I don't want to torture the audience with Sanskrit, but Kṛṣṇa is acknowledging that he has an eternal depth of love with his devotees. And because of that, he will try to pay back, and this is like a premonition to his appearance as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, which he tries to pay back the love to his devotee, but the more he tries to pay back, the more the debt increases. That's the paradox of love. Now, you want to give something back, but the more you want to give that in love, since there is love, the other person will never receive what you are giving and take it for himself, herself, but will offer that back in love. So you find yourself, oh, my debt increased now. But that's the only way we can transcend the karmic debt of negative numbers that we are in, to acquire a positive debt in terms of divine love. So the more you give, the more you enter into an actual loving relationship, the more the debt increases. But it's okay. That is not a problem. That's the thing. No?
So was there anything more to say about different kinds of impersonalism, or the relationship between Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta?
Yeah, what I would like just to mention, one little point in this connection, since we are speaking also about the charm of personalism, if you will, by contrast. And many times, of course, members of our tradition or other traditions, personalist traditions, have spoken themselves very strongly about impersonalism. And that has given place to also sometimes what I will consider very unnecessarily violent or sectarian condemnation of those practitioners. Well, also it's important to understand that some of those expressions coming from great personalities, also some of them, not all of them, come from very ecstatic emotional experiences where they are experiencing the personalist point of view and relishing it to such a degree that they will say, oh, this is impersonalist thing is like whatever, something not very flattering. But they are speaking from that particular perspective, not something very subjective, if you will, in their transcendental experience. And of course, with this, I'm not trying to justify unnecessary expressions of fundamentalism. So my point is, again, if there is a possibility of attaining this impersonal state in eternity, it's not our goal as personalists, but there is the possibility. If this can be attained in eternity, how bad, if you will, such a thing actually is? Because, of course, from a subjective monotheistic lens, it's quite bad. Because for us, there is no prospect for love and interaction, there is no individuality, no experience. But from a more removed and impartial observation, it may not be so for those outside of one's own monotheistic circle and who are finding relief and peace from the negative numbers reaching the 0 or reaching the 1. So my point is that I think there is place also for allowing that to happen without the need of condemning or insulting that person. Again, from our monotheistic lens, impersonalism is problematic from reasons that we have already shared. But we could also conclude by speaking, I will say, if you would like, we can go in this direction, that not only impersonalism is problematic, but also something even more problematic is when different forms of impersonalism are embodied in the guise of personalism. Well, where someone who officially is a personalist somehow or other is expressing impersonalism through their own acts or behavior. I don't know how tempting that venue sounds to you, Arjuna.
Yeah, we can get to that for sure, but perhaps we could speak a little bit more about problems of impersonalism. So you touched on how you gave a very mature and nuanced explanation of why impersonalism is bad. And I mean, perhaps you're not even saying it's bad, but what you are saying is, for someone who's tasted the personalist transcendental reality, the idea of being devoid of that personalistic experience is horrendous. However, for someone who's not experienced that personalistic transcendental reality and has just experienced the Brahman impersonal effulgence and attained that, they're fully satisfied.
Or who only experience the miseries of negative numbers,
Yeah.
The aspect of eternal peace is more than enough.
So one a principle I like to think about in epistemology is, well, it applies to epistemology too, but it also applies to preferences. So in epistemology, how it works is my current worldview could be mistaken. And I can believe that while also knowing for a fact that my current worldview is more accurate to my previous worldviews. So you're in a dream and you think the dreams were real. You wake up from the dream and now you understand that was a dream and this is reality. But it's still possible that I could wake up from this experience of reality to something even more real and find this was all, and so on. So I can have ascending levels of realization while at this always getting close to the truth and knowing that I'm getting close to the truth without knowing that every feature of what I currently believe is true. So in the same way with, we have that verse in Bhagavad Gita, param drishva nivartate, you give up a lower taste by experiencing a higher taste. So, and I guess this relates to our personalism and personalism stuff too, like there's these material things that create so much problem. They're very addicting. They're very hard to give up. But if you can get something better, the devotee who experiences high quality prasadam does not miss eating meat at all, not in any way. Yeah, it's like, oh, but don't you miss it? It's like, no, I've got prasadam. It tastes amazing. So similarly, like this with when you have become more advanced, then nothing about the material world becomes interesting. So what we're talking about here in this context is that if you experience that personal reality, we could take if you took all those people who have attained permanently an abode in the impersonal Brahman, and they got a flavor of bhakti of the personal, maybe they'd be like, oh, this is better. I'm going to give up this thing because it's something lower.
Of course, I'm not denying that, but of course, again, by definition, if someone attained that plane, they will stay there. And my point with this is, objectively speaking, we can speak about different levels of experience in transcendence, even different degrees of penetration into transcendence. Even in Hinduism, monotheism, there are different conceptions of God: Vishnu, Narayan, Ramachandra, Kṛṣṇa, Mahaprabhu, different possibilities of relationship with God, which will afford different degrees of intimacy, proximity, sweetness in relationship. But my point is, although even if objectively you can establish there is a gradation there and a hierarchy, and this is the sweetest, for example, we Gauḍīya Vaishnava will argue the relationship that Gauḍīya Vaishnavism offers with Krishna in Vrindavan is objectively the sweetest, most intimate possibility of connection with God. That said, subjectively speaking, even objectively that's the sweetest, subjectively people may not like that much of sweet.
Right.
I can tell you objectively mango is the sweetest fruit, and you can tell me, yes, Maharaj, but I like apples more. And it's okay. I mean, it's not that I have to force you to swallow the mango, if you will, and you may be okay with that level of sweetness. So my point is, according to whatever experiences we have acquired in our past lifetimes, as we consider there are, we will develop certain samskars. No? Samskars means impressions, in particular sangha or in particular association. So that samskars will also predispose us to a certain particular approach to the absolute, which will make perfect sense for us. Even if you come and tell me, but try this and this the best, and objectively that may be the best or the sweetest, whatever. If someone has a particular predisposition acquired by samskara that's really embedded into that, and that's in relation to something transcendental, then that person may be fixed there. And also I will say we shouldn't feel the need of taking all that people out and bring all of them to us, because sometimes this is tricky. We may say, no, I'm doing this out of compassion. But not necessarily that may be the case. Sometimes we are doing that because we don't have enough faith, and we need the whole of the rest of the world doing the same thing we are doing, so they convince me that I'm in the correct place doing the right thing.
Right.
So it's externally disguised as compassion, but actually it's a lack of security in my own process, and I need all of you doing that same thing, so you somehow give me feedback that I'm doing the right thing.
So here's an analogy. I mean, I like the negative values thing. So here I'm going to, instead of talking about negative numbers, I'm going to talk about sweet rice with sand in it, or shards of glass instead of jewels, or something like that. You know, things that are objectively suffering. Nobody is going to prefer that over anything that doesn't have those negative qualities. But then we can have a realm of things you can eat, which we could imagine some kind of peasant gruel. We could, let's say, you know, the stuff they were eating in the 1800s or 1500s probably wasn't meeting all the nutritional needs, but we can imagine somebody took some particular grain, made it into a porridge, took some vegetables, boiled them to hell, ground it all up into this porridge, and you could eat this breakfast, lunch, and dinner and meet all of your nutritional requirements and be fully healthy, just for the sake of a thought experiment. So on this analogy, me might want to say the impersonalist is eating this boring substance, getting all the nutritional requirements met, but there's no variety. Whereas the Hare Kṛṣṇa, you know, the personalist is having different things for breakfast every day. I had a friend from Gujarat. He said when he goes home and visits his parents, he can go 3 months without his parents making the same food preparation twice. So when we talk about trying to, you know, obviously all the people that are eating shards of glass or eating food with sand in it, we want to be like, no, don't eat that stuff with the sand in it. Here's stuff with no sand in it. But, you know, for the people, the impersonalist that's happy with the peasant gruel, we might just say, if you're happy, I mean, whatever. It seems strange to me, but you're meeting all your nutritional requirements. You can continue like that, whatever, fine. And I could bring this over to the Abrahamic traditions, where they, instead of, you know, they think that by not, people who don't practice the same religion as them are going to burn in eternal hellfire. So they can't have the same kind of, oh, well, you know, you're getting a different destination, there's different flavors, but I guess you can be happy there. They have to have this extreme determination to save people from hell. Okay, not all versions of Abrahamic traditions believe that. I'm just talking about certain versions who believe that, just to be fair, accurate.
Thank you. I was just going to clarify that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree again. No, I mean, for someone that experience is great. I mean, you say that's boring, but again, you are saying boring from your particular experience of something else that is not boring. But for them, that's it. That's everything. So it's subjective. There is subjectivity in transcendence. That's the point. Now if we're of course in non-transcendence, there is also subjectivity, but it's problematic. But if you are beyond material influence and on transcendence, you will find each one will be totally satisfied with their own situation, basically. And that's what is depicted in this famous Brihad Bhagavatamrita book by Sanatana Goswami. This devotee Gopakumar is traveling through many planets and finding different devotees, in this case devotees, and with different degrees of devotion for Ram, for Vishnu, for Narayan, for Krishna, and Marthur, and each one of them is fully satisfied in their own situation. And he's inspired by seeing that, but that inspires not him to stay there, but to continue his journey to his own if you will, level of attraction, if you will, but nonetheless he's able to nourish from the faith or the particular insight of other people. So that's an interesting, I will say, challenging experience for all of us. I mean, not only like condemn those who we differ from or whom we consider inferior, but developing the capacity of drawing, nourishing, and inspiration, not to the point that we may necessarily be doing what they're doing, but just how I can be nourished from mystical Christianity in my own Gauḍīya Vaishnava tradition. I mean, that's an interesting question, or some other examples, whatever. No? So I think that's also interesting for us to get to a level of dialogue and maturity in being able to draw something. Although, again, we may disagree on even foundational terms, like with Advaita Vedanta or Buddhism or whatever, but it doesn't mean that we cannot have a conversation or we cannot agree on some points even. That's the point. Mm-hmm.
I think we need to talk a little bit more about what we might want to call insidious versions of Advaita Vedanta. So we have this concept of aparad. So you were talking about what we might want to call a Brahmavadi. And Brahmavadis, we don't have any hostility towards. But then there's another category that is actually actively criticizing the forms of Kṛṣṇa and so on. And we consider that to be aparad. And perhaps it's warranted to have a little bit of hostility towards this, because this is actually creating negative impacts on people's spiritual life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are the two basic differences of impersonalism that I described before, that you now, of course, presented them from this perspective. Sometimes they are described in terms of Brahmavadi and Mayavadi, just to make a difference. So yeah, the Brahmavadi is the one who, again, acknowledges I'm a soul. It's not that everything is Brahman, but I feel attracted to merging into that reality. But I acknowledge there is Bhagavan, there is the personal form of the divine, and its eternal form, eternal name, eternal everything. But I feel this particular attraction to connect with this aspect of the absolute. Remember, Brahman is an aspect of the absolute, so it's not something else. So yeah, in that case, there's one type of relationship that we can have, and of course I understand your point that others will consider, no, actually the form of Kṛṣṇa, everything about that is ultimately illusory, and in that connection the worship, the devotees of Kṛṣṇa will take a stronger stance. And I can understand, which of course I personally think doesn't need to turn into a civil war or something, but yes, to take strong particular stance regarding defending one's points, but also defending one point doesn't mean attacking the other person necessarily. Of course, you can attack the point, but not the person, and be clear in your philosophical presentation without the need of becoming like emotional and really getting beyond the debate, if you will. That sometimes it happens, especially in social media, I would say. But yeah, I understand the difference between the two and how one should learn how to relate to everyone, while at the same time internally trying to remain respectful and compassionate from everyone, because that's still the mandate in our school. You have to, even if you have to take distance or to speak strongly, defend some point, at the same time you cannot become hateful or revengeful, but just remain compassionate, even if that may happen 1,000 miles from distance from that person or something externally. Right?
So what about this idea that certain forms of impersonalism create an attitude which is actually harmful to spiritual progress? Like we use this word aparad, which we translate as offenses, but I think from a Western point of view, people can misunderstand what we mean by offenses, because they think, oh, so God's this kind of person who's easily upset, and like you just do the slightest misunderstanding of him and he gets all like upset and that hurts your spiritual life. I think what we mean by the word is actually the opposite, that, you know, God is this great being, but an offense is where you have a particular mentality which holds you back spiritually, which creates impediments for you. It's not that God's getting upset by you, it's just that the attitude you're having is hurting your spiritual ability to make spiritual progress.
Yeah, so basically the notion of aparad has to do with biting the hand that is feeding you, if you will. No? Like if you are following a path of bhakti that we are following, Aparat basically has to do, because sometimes this word aparat has been also misunderstood and has been also like weaponized, I would say, to instill fear and create neurosis, even in practitioners of bhakti, in the sense of, don't do this because that's aparat, and this aparat. So, and that creates a kind of frozenness where you feel whatever you do is calculating not to do aparat. Instead of having a positive orientation to your devotional life, you are doing everything in such a way that you avoid aparat, which is not the idea. And of course, aparat doesn't mean to do or offense. Aparat means that which goes against love, etymologically. Aparada. Radha means the personification of love, Sri Radha, and apa means to go against that. So basically means to attack love, to attack devotion, to have evil intention against love and affection, which you have to be pretty evil to do that, if you will. In one sense, it's not so easy to commit aparat in that sense. I don't want to make it slightly, so relax, there's no aparat, but also don't take it to the extreme of, I must be doing aparat every single moment. No, if one is sincerely trying to do things properly and sincerely and open to learn and change, if you make a mistake, that's not much of a big obstacle. I mean, you will be receiving the proper correction or the proper advice and instruction in a loving way, and you are open to grow, and that's it. There's no need to create like a bigger thing with aparat, because if not, our whole orientation to spiritual life will be a fear, basically, and calculation, not doing aparat, not doing that, and so on. So again, when someone explicitly attacks devotion, that falls into another category, whether it's in the very same devotional school or outside of it. We will try to take another stance. But again, even in that case, the stance is not hateful, violent, revengeful, but just intelligent enough to know where to stand, if others are doing that or if we are doing that. But again, I emphasize this a lot because I've seen so much of neurosis in my more than 20 years of practice.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, yeah.
No? And again, it can become a tool for manipulation. Like, I'm doing something wrong, and you cannot see anything wrong in the Swami because that's aparat.
Yeah.
So everyone is like, okay, we cannot see anything wrong, but he's doing something wrong. I cannot say anything because aparat. So that opens the door for lots of abuse and exploitation. And so also it's important, not to weaponize these terms and to understand them with sensitivity and common sense, I would say, right?
So my question here about impersonalism is if there's some versions of it that are benign, a subjective difference of opinion, that's fine if you want to go on that path. But if there's other versions of it that are insidious, that will take people backwards or prevent them from making progress, or like one way that might play out is it could be that somebody on this path might attain that impersonal realization, but it could also be that if they start that path at all, they'll be given certain rhetoric and a certain understanding that'll mean they're guaranteed to never take to a personal path. And so the more benign paths might be leave them open to they can make progress here and then advance to bhakti later on if they so choose, or whatever it might be that makes it fitting to call it an insidious version of impersonalism.
Of course, again, we could speak about the more benign forms of that, in which, as I mentioned, you are open to acknowledge the existence of other paths, other realities, and it's not just there's only this one Brahman and everything is false. So whatever you consider real, whatever your path, whatever your God, if you will, that's all false and only Brahman is real, which is pretty reductionistic, if you will. And and we, from our personal devotional school of thought, will consider that won't be healthy, basically. While if you have an inclination towards impersonalism, while you acknowledge there is the personalist side of the absolute, but I just happen not to be attracted in that direction for whatever reason, that leaves the door open for one to attain one's impersonalist pursuit, if you will. Well, according to our philosophy, if you keep a stance in which you deny everything and you consider the form of God as unreal and all that, that will be hampering your progress and creating obstacles to that impersonal goal you're after, if you will.
So if impersonalism is bad, it's bad because it could prevent somebody from taking to a personalist path. But the goal that those impersonalist paths can give people can make them free from suffering and fully satisfied in an impersonal way.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that impersonalism is bad because it won't allow you to go to a personalist path. I wouldn't say that.
Certain
because,
versions
again,
of it, maybe.
Yeah. Because if some realization is possible for eternity, how bad that can be.
Yeah,
if
sure.
that's bad, there is some bad in eternity, and we have a problem there, a whole theological problem. Something is plausible there. There must be something good, which may not be as good as we as we feel. It's not as good, but it's still good. But we could speak about something bad in terms of some versions of it that won't allow you to taste, to experience that good, which represents the impersonal experience in transcendence, which again, for us is not good enough, but we won't describe that as bad either.
One analogy I like to use in terms of to describe this feature of the soul to search for a spiritual truth and not stop looking till it finds spiritual satisfaction is power tools. So I'm an electrician, so I use power tools every day, and I don't stuff around with Chinese brands. You know, I don't just go to Bunnings and buy the cheapest thing off the shelf. I use DeWalt. Some people use Makita. Some people use Milwaukee. But what you won't find is there won't be a single professional tradesman who uses a crappy tool. You'll find DIYers who on the weekend, 5 times a year, they'll do a little handyman stuff around their house. They might just use the cheapest tool they can get from Bunnings, and they'll tolerate it for a short time. But if that person does an apprenticeship, takes up a trade, and becomes a tradesman, nobody's forcing them to stop using the crappy tools and buy nice tools. They're just gonna do it because it's objectively a better choice. So bringing it back to what you just said about impersonalism, if there's a kind of drill that I think is a crappy drill, but somebody who's a professional tradesman and been using that same drill for the last 5 years on a daily basis is happy with it, how crappy can it really be?
If it works for eternity, how crap it can really be.
Yeah, right.
At least it's a tool that works for the type of thing the work they are doing.
Yeah, they might be doing a different kind of work from what I'm doing.
We have some other work to do in transcendence, and we may need some other tools. And that's another, if you will.
That's a good way of putting it. Their tool might not work for what I do because I do different sorts of work, or I go about my work in a different way. So this can bring us to our final point. We're coming up on 2 hours just about, so we can wrap it up shortly. But you wanted to talk about impersonalism in a different way. Now, I think there might be an equivocation going on with the word impersonalism here, because till now we were talking about impersonalism in terms of an ontological worldview and how we understand what exists in our relationship to that reality. Is there one, is ultimate reality 1 or 0 or 2, or both 1 and 2 simultaneously in an inconceivable way? But when this other way of using the word impersonalism doesn't have anything to do with an ontological philosophical understanding of reality, it's more how personal relationships are conducted and whether we treat each other in a personal way or whether we're impersonal to one another. I think we might be equivocating on the words. Do you know what I mean by an equivocation fallacy?
Yeah. So sorry for that if we are incurring in that.
I'm not sure. I'm asking it as a question. You can give your thoughts if you think so.
Yeah. As you mentioned, when I'm speaking about here of impersonalism in the guise of personalism, I'm not saying that a personalist will start to suddenly promote officially, exponentially, a particular Advaiting doctrine, but mostly to behave in a way that is not personal enough, in which we act as if we are not persons. So I'm extending the notion of impersonalism here beyond the official ontological, theological perspective. So in that sense, I'm saying, for example, not necessarily someone who is an Advaiting follower of Advaita Vedanta will behave in an unhuman way, but also not necessarily a personalist will behave as personally as his own doctrine demands. Because again, to say I'm a personalist has a lot of implications. It's not just I believe in a personal God. but also I believe that I'm a person. So if I'm a person, what does it mean that I'm a person? What does it mean that God's a person? What's the result of two persons relating with one another, me and God? Which are the implications of that? So if on my daily basis as a personalist, I don't treat others as persons, or I don't even treat myself as a person, which can happen, or I don't treat myself as all that I can be as a person, because we are something, but there is potential also. We are what we are, and we are all that we can be. So how much of a difference there is between personalism and impersonalism in that sense? My point is, I may officially proclaim, I believe I'm a personalist, but my beliefs are not enough to proclaim a belief. Beliefs are not to be proclaimed. Beliefs are to be acted out. So if with my personal example, I'm not that personal, I'm quite depersonalized, despite whatever I may proclaim verbally, then I am, for all intents and purposes, an impersonalist, and in disguised one, which is something even more tricky. So there are different ways of expressing that, of course. No, I mean, I can share some examples, but I think you get the basic premise.
Just a quick question: for the impersonalist schools, do their teachings not expect them to treat each other nicely?
I mean, I cannot speak in detail about that. I've not been part of their schools and the way they go into those details, but I've met many followers of Advaita Vedanta, which are pretty nice people to relate to on human level. That's my point. No? So you can feel that they have this type of also of instruction, if you will, or teaching, although ultimately all that disillusion disappears. But on an empirical, temporary level, if you want to put it like that, they promote those values probably as something becoming for the eventual dismissal of all of them, if you will. So again, for me, sorry, you were saying something.
Oh, yeah, just to explore the semantic side of it a bit more before we go into the details of how it plays out. I think, maybe it's not an equivocation fallacy because it's an entailment of a personalist philosophy that we act in very personal ways. And how it might play out differently from an impersonalist is if you have attained that impersonal realization, you've ceased to exist as a person. And I'm probably, the words I'm choosing are philosophically inaccurate, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'll put that aside and speak in an accurate way. So, they merge into this impersonal Brahman effulgence. If you walk past them and they don't offer you a glass of water while they merge into this impersonal effulgence, you're not really going to get offended. They're not doing business as a person, so they're not expected to act in a personal way at all. But while they're here in this plane, acting as a person, they're going to say this is just an external illusion. They still might be expecting themselves, according to the philosophy, to do the acting as a person. What do they call it? Paramatmika and
Pramartika and Vyaviharika.
So they talk about how, according to Vyaviharika, we have to do certain things in the world. We have to act in personal ways. But once we attain Paramatmika,
Paramartika.
You can comment on that, and then you can go on to your next point.
Yeah, that's basically the idea. No, they will refer to and they do lots of charity work and hospitals, and lots of good things, good deeds in the world. All of philosophically speaking, ultimately, all that is illusion, but that will be considered for those who have not reached that level of realization, if you will, as something that somehow is favorable to the culture of the lifestyle and sadhana they are carrying on, and to the goal they are pointing to. So that on that side, and in connection to how we as personalists may actually not fully represent our tradition and more be promoting impersonalism, let me, just to conclude, share a few examples. For example, again, we as people have feelings. So if we deny or neglect our feelings, that tends to make us impersonal. So, for example, impersonalism arises when someone denies that God has senses. That's part of the premise of impersonalism. God has no senses, or even transcendental one. So that's impersonalism. So if we deny that we or others have senses, and senses include here feelings or emotions, we are promoting impersonalism. We are not allowing that to happen. Or, for example, something interesting that has happened, a phenomenon, not pointing to someone as guilty, just what it happened, by superficially shunning one's own culture while not having fully developed another culture, but trying to embrace that, like it happened with Gauḍīya Vaishnavism when it came to the West. Somehow we were raised in a certain culture, a new culture came, and of course we embraced that, but in some cases there was a superficial like rejection of certain elements of the Western culture, which ended up us being dysfunctional in between no culture whatsoever. And that can be another form of impersonalism as well. Or in our particular traditions, for example, Gauḍīya Vaishnavism, we sing the names of Kṛṣṇa, and for us, the name of Krishna and Krishna are identical, non-difference. The name is a person. So if we sing the name of Krishna, who is a person, but we do not treat the name of Krishna as a person, we are not, as an individual, we are not investing our own individuality while chanting, that may be another form of impersonalism, because we are not relating as people, as individuals, basically. We are not allowing ourselves to be fully, to be all that we can be through divine grace, but we are conforming to a limited level of participation. Or again, treating others. And when I say treating others or even ourselves not as people, I'm not meaning to brutally abuse them like it was done in Auschwitz or some concentration camp, but basically not seeing them as all of that they can be, as spiritual souls with certain unlimited potential. And I think most of do that actually, on one level or another. So in this sense, we all can be impersonalists on some level. That's my point. This is a nuanced idea. It's not that you are 100% impersonalist or you are not at all. There are degrees of both. And this is similar in relation to proclaim ourselves as theists. Now we can say, I believe in God. But recently a famous intellectual said, I live as if there is a God. Like implying, for me to believe in God doesn't just mean to state it, but you have to act it out. And unless you are acting out that fully, you should be very careful of saying that. I believe in God. What's the full implications of believing in God? God only knows what you will be if you truly believed in every single sense of the term. That will be a transfiguring event, and there's no limit to such event. So at the same time, we can proclaim, I am theist, but we can be on a daily basis engaging what Parker Palmer called functional atheism, which is the belief that the ultimate responsibility for everything rests with me. And we sometimes conduct ourselves in our life like that. It all depends on what I do. And that's a kind of practical daily atheism or chosen ignorance among many believers. So that happens, or other forms of impersonalism that come to mind. If you give me a few minutes and we are concluding. For example, some people is informed about spiritual life, and a spiritual life can be individual, is hyper personal, but some people become afraid of that. Or some people is terrifying to become a person, because that's big responsibility. And some people don't like that. So some people naturally prefer a kind of merging into some type of impersonal void, to take a rest from being a person with all the responsibilities it entails. And some people will try to merge into the Brahman, but some other people, even personalists, quote unquote, may try to merge into an institution and become just another face in the crowd without expression, without proper individual criteria, just observing what's going on around. And they consider this behavior, that's spiritual life. Or some other people is afraid to think because of possible social ramifications. I may be isolated, ostracized, I may be denied future perks, whatever. So they choose not to participate, basically. They cancel their head and heart, and all that becomes atrophied. No? So what's left there? Again, impersonalism. So these are some again, examples of how you can express impersonalism while externally remaining personalist, if you will. So again, we are persons, God is a person. What's all that can happen in such an exchange between two people? I mean, there's a lot. So and when you play the implications of that fully, and with this I conclude, we have the notion that we may call radical personalism. Now, today we spoke about radical impersonalism or radical non-dualism. But when you go deeper into what's all the possibilities that lie in us being a person, in God being a person, then you have the other side of the spectrum, which is radical personalism. Indeed, I'm doing a whole series of lectures nowadays with that particular title, radical personalism, all that we can possibly be as individuals in spiritual life.
Cool, thanks for that. So I guess your last comments, the basic theme is you could be characterized as we have the highest philosophy, but in many cases poor execution of the philosophy.
Again, I personally experience this as the highest philosophy, but I'm not here claiming that others have to accept that and surrender to that. I don't feel comfortable with that type of thing. But I've subjectively experienced this at the highest, because if not, why I'm doing that, why I'm belonging to that. And that's, as you mentioned, especially if this is something very high, very deep, and if you are representing that poorly, such a contrast is totally unbecoming, because in the name of a very high philosophy and a very noble and deep concepts, if you end up over-justifying very low things in the name of the highest concepts, that makes me cringe, basically. That's totally unbecoming. So we should be very careful, especially if we belong to a very sophisticated tradition with lots of details and very nuanced information, how we represent that in practice. Because if not, we can just be speaking from our mouth very highly, but with a very archaic and primitive example representing those teachings. And of course, that's not the idea, for sure.
Okay, cool. We'll wrap it up there. We're up to 2 hours and 10 minutes. So thanks for sharing that. I'm sure we'll have you back on again sometime.
Thank you so much for the invitation.